Welcome to this episode of Lectures with Liddington. This is going to be our first stop in our unit when we talk about genetics. So genetics is a unit with a lot of vocabulary. So as we go through, we're going to throw a ton of vocabulary words at you. So we're going to start right now with all of the important vocabulary about what we call Mendelian genetics or Mendelian inheritance. So why do we call it Mendelian? Because of a very important man named Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel is what we call, or who we call the father of heredity. And what heredity is, this is the passing on of traits or genetic information. Back in the day, in Mendel's time, he didn't quite understand the idea of DNA the way that we do, and the fact that this is what's inherited is this genetic information. But he did see traits and the fact that these characteristics were passed down. So Mendel, a little bit of info about who he was. So he was a monk in Austria. And because he was a monk, he had a lot of time on his hands. He was the science and math teacher there at the monastery. So he was interested in science. He also was interested in plants. So he would tend to the garden that they kept there at the monastery. And what he did was, as he was taking care of this garden, he noticed some things about the characteristics of those plants. So when he saw this sort of pattern of these characteristics within the plants, he said, I think there's something going on here. I think there's some information, some traits being passed on to different generations. So he came up with some experiments to study genetics. The study of heredity is what we call genetics. So while Mendel was here at the monastery, he noticed that these traits were passed on. Traits, these are characteristics. So your hair color, your eye color, height, whether or not you have a hitchhiker's thumb, things like that. In humans, those are human traits. But what he looked at were actually peas. When you tend to a garden, you end up with peas in the garden, right? So he set up a bunch of experiments with these peas to test how these traits were inherited. So what he did know was that something got passed down. So he deemed this thing a gene. So these genes are the things, the information that gets passed down. So now we know that genes are located on the DNA. At the time, that was not something that Mendel was aware of, but we know that now. He did understand this concept that, hey, a parent has this trait, and now the offspring are seeing that trait or seeing different traits. He could see those patterns being inherited. Now, there are different traits, right? But which information you have for that trait, those are the alleles. So these are the different copies you could have of the genes. These are the different options or copies of that gene. So if we're talking about these peas over here, we could have white or purple flowers. So the allele for white would be one letter, would be represented by 1, And then your allele for the purple would be a different allele. It's a different version of that information. So it's the gene for flower color, but the allele is which color. Same thing works for eye color, right? You could have blue eyes, you could have brown eyes, right? The allele will say blue or brown, but it's the gene for eye color. So it's the gene for the trait, and the alleles are which pieces of information. So two other important vocab words here that we're going to throw at you are discussing what we're looking at. One of those is phenotype. Phenotype are the physical characteristics. So if we're talking about pea plants, then we're talking about green pea pod, green yellow pod, or yellow pea pod, wrinkled peas, round peas. These are the physical traits that you're seeing. Whereas the genotype, this is which alleles. So the information on the genes. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, here is what it means. So some of you may recognize this pretty spiffy little square over here. It's called a Punnett square. We use them in genetics all the time. It is a tool that we use to help us understand patterns of inheritance and how traits are passed down. So when we talk about Mendelian inheritance, this is what we call complete dominance. So in complete dominance, you have two alleles. We represent alleles with letters. So here is my big B. That's one allele. Here's a little b. That's another allele. Each one of these boxes here represents the allele that comes from either the sperm from dad or the egg from mom. So here is the allele that you could possibly get. That allele, this combination here, that's my genotype. The phenotype in this case would be purple flower. So when we say the phenotype, we're talking about what we see. The genotype says what information is coded on those genes. So in Mendelian inheritance, we have complete dominance, which means two different alleles. We've got big B and little b that represent a dominant and a recessive trait. With the dominant trait, you only need one copy in order to see that phenotype. So we use capital letters to represent dominant traits. So big B would be dominant. And this little b here would be recessive. So my recessive trait, I need two copies in order to see that phenotype. Notice I've got a purple flower here and a purple flower here. So they both show the purple phenotype. But in order to get the white over here, I have to have two copies. See, two copies, two little b's, two recessive traits in order to have the expression of that recessive trait. So another term, set of terms that we use when we talk about genetics are homozygous and heterozygous. And this simply means whether or not those two alleles are the same or different, right? So if it's homozygous, they are two of the same alleles. If it's heterozygous, it's one of each. So my two parents here, let's erase a little bit. Boo, boo. My two parents here would both be what? Yep, they would both be heterozygous. We've got one dominant, one recessive, so that is heterozygous. If we look here, that offspring is homozygous. There are two of the same alleles. So in this Punnett square, you're going to see some stuff we're going to talk about later. Next episode, we're going to do way more of these. We're going to look at these Punnett squares and how we can use these Punnett squares to help us understand genetics and how different traits can be passed down to offspring. So for right there, we're going to pause and we're going to practice some of this heavy vocabulary before we dive into, hey, this Punnett square thing, how do I use it?